I have closed 900 worlds. Let that stand at the top of the account before I am forced to write her name. Because once her name is written, you will misread everything that follows. You will call it failure. It was not failure. A ledger does not fail. It counts what the assay lays upon the pan, and it strikes out what the pan takes, and when the last figure is entered, it is the quiet thing that leaves the room after the lights. 900 times I have drawn the line beneath the sum, and the sum has held. That is the whole of what I am. I do not fight. I do not choose. I total. So understand that when I tell you a single line in a book of 4 million would not be crossed out, I am not confessing a weakness. I am reporting an impossibility. She was an error. One entry the world tried to settle and could not, and I was the clerk assigned to settle her. Her name was Josephine Harrow, and on the night I first tallied her, she was riding under the sea to threaten a man. It rained the way it rains over a harbor city, sideways and without conviction. And she came down the platform steps of the crosswater terminal with water running off a coat that had stopped being waterproof years before. She did not hurry. I want that on the record too, because everyone else on that platform hurried. The last train through the bore was the last of the night, and the crowd pressed for it the way frightened things press, shoulder into shoulder, breath fogging, and she walked through them as if they were scaffolding she had already decided would hold her weight. Tall, lean to the point of hardness, hair cropped close and gone silver too early, so that under the sodium lamps it looked like something struck rather than grown. A burn scar ran the length of her right forearm, puckered and pale, the kind a body earns standing too near a structure while it decides to come down. She read the train before she boarded it. I did not know then what that reading was. I know now. Where you and I would see a train, she saw a diagram of stresses. She saw the seams in the carriage steel, the places the welds had been rushed, the coupling that had been swapped and never seated true. She had spent her life being paid to look at built things and know precisely how they would fall, and she had never learned to switch the seeing off. It bled into people. She would look at a man across a table and find the joint where he was weakest, the load he could not carry, the exact word that would fold him, and she would file it and keep it and, when the time came, place her thumb on it and press. That is why she was on the train. The man was Emmett Shaw. Once he had been her partner, in the small, clean way that word can mean two people who build together and split the cost of the coffee. They had a firm. They had a design. Hers. A span meant to carry a road across the mouth of the very harbor she was now riding under. The thing she had drawn nights for and defended in rooms full of louder men. The thing with her signature at the bottom of the sheet. Emmett had put his name over hers. He had sold the firm out from beneath her to men who wanted the drawing and not the drawer. Taken the money it made and bought himself passage overseas before she understood that the ground she stood on had already been sold. He had done it cleanly. He had done it the way you rob someone you know will not weep, only calculate. She had calculated. She had found where he was, a berth on a ship leaving from the far shore before dawn, and she had found that the fast way to the far shore was under the water, through the bore, on the last train of the night. She was not going for the money. I have audited enough of the dead to know the difference between a person chasing what they lost and a person chasing what they are owed. She was going to stand in front of him and name, without heat, every place he would break, so that he would carry it onto his ship and out into his new, clean life and never be free of the knowledge that she had seen him whole and found him small. She found a seat by the door. She did not take her phone out. She watched the other passengers the way she watched everything. And I will grant her this: she was rarely wrong about which of them would run and which would freeze, though it did neither of them any good in the end. Across the aisle, a boy slept against his mother. Further down, two dock workers argued in low voices about a horse. A woman in a good coat held a paper cup of coffee she never drank. Josephine Harrow catalogued them without kindness and without cruelty, the way a surveyor catalogues a slope. And then the doors sealed with a sound like a held breath, and the train slid out of the light and into the throat of the bore. For a while it was only the ordinary dark of being underground, the dark that has a wall a few feet beyond the glass. The tunnel lamps strobed past, orange, 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 laying their rhythm over her reflection until her own face flickered back at her, patient and unafraid. She felt the train take the long descending curve that carried the line beneath the deepest part of the harbor, the part where the water overhead was measured not in feet but in atmospheres. And if she thought anything at all about the weight above her, she thought of it as a load, and of the tunnel as a structure, and of the structure as sound. I remember the moment the way you remember the last ordinary thing before a fall, because it was the last moment the account made sense. There was a great deal of water above them, and a great many souls around her, and a number I could have written for each. A worth, a sum the Assay had already begun to reckon as it does with every world it comes to weigh. The reckoning was almost complete. My pen was, you might say, uncapped. Then the orange lamps went out. Not one, not in sequence, the way a fault runs down a failing line. All of them. At once. The whole length of the bore, from the far shore to the near, dropped into a black so total that the woman with the coffee made a small sound and the boy woke. And into that black something came that I had no figure for. I have watched the Assay descend on 900 worlds, and I have never lacked a number for what it brought. That night, for the first and worst time, the dark beyond the glass was not empty and was not dark. It was being written on. Something was moving through the tunnel that did not obey the tunnel, drawing lines of a light that was every color and no color, reordering the space the way a hand reorders a page it has decided to correct. The water above them did not matter to it. The steel did not matter to it. It was rewriting the terms. Josephine Harrow turned from her own reflection and looked into it, and I, who was there to total her death, felt the pen tremble in my grip. It came into the carriage the way a correction comes into a sentence, and everything it touched was struck through. I will describe it as I am able, though the truth is that I was not built to witness the Assay work so close to the flesh. I am the clerk who comes after. I total the room once the room is finished. But that night the Assay descended faster than its own procedure, hungry in a way I had not seen in 900 closings. And it began its appraisal inside a moving train with me still fumbling my pages, so that I saw the weighing done in front of me, seat by seat, soul by soul. The woman in the good coat was first. The light of every color and no color found her, considered the sum of her, and struck her out. She did not scream. There was no time in which to scream. The paper cup fell through the space her hand had occupied and struck the floor and rolled, and the cold coffee spread across the aisle, and that was all that remained of her in my book. A line drawn, a figure carried, a stain. The Assay had found her worth insufficient and had simply erased the entry. The dock workers it did not erase. It found something in them it wished to keep, and keeping, in the grammar of the Assay, is worse than erasing. They came apart at the joints and were put back wrong. Their argument about the horse died in their throats and became a lower sound, a wet reordering of purpose. And when the light released them, they were no longer men who argued. They were the first of the assets, audited constructs, The Assay's monsters, made from the world's own material, which is the cruelty of it. Nothing is imported to end you. You are ended with your neighbors. The boy woke and reached for his mother, and his mother was already turning into something that would not know him. And through all of it, Josephine Harrow did the one thing I had no column for. She got low. She had felt the coupling before it failed. I know this now, though at the time I could not account for it. She had catalogued it on the platform. The coupling swapped and never seated true, and when the light entered the carriage and the driver ahead ceased to be a driver, the train lost its mind and its brakes at once, and the long descending curve beneath the deepest part of the harbor became a thing with no one holding it. The carriages behind piled their weight forward, the bad coupling let go, and Joss, who had spent a lifetime being paid to know exactly how built things fall, did not look at the light. She looked at the ceiling of the carriage and saw where it would fold. It folded there. Steel came down along the line she had already read, and she was not beneath it, because she had thrown herself into the doorframe an instant before the ceiling arrived, into the one wedge of structure that would hold when the rest gave. The carriage screamed sideways into the tunnel wall and stopped being a carriage. Glass went to powder. The lamps that were already dead swung on their dead wires, and in the ringing after, Joss Harrow lay in the surviving corner of a wreck that should have killed her, breathing, cataloging, alive by no permission of mine. That should have been the end of the entry. A survivor of the descent is still a body the assets will find. One of the remade dock workers turned toward her in the dark, its shape wrong against the little light, and came. And here is what I must set down plainly, because it is the hinge of everything I failed to prevent. The Assay, weighing her even as she lay in the ruin, found her worth sufficient. It offered her a seating. You have been told it is a menu. It is not a menu. There is no list, no voice, no courteous prompt. There is a pressure that arrives with the shape of a question, an opening in the self through which a single capacity may be drawn and set into the flesh, and it lasts no longer than a heartbeat, and most who receive it reach for the wrong thing, or reach for nothing, and die. Joss did not reach for strength, which she wanted, or for speed, which would have saved her sooner. She reached, without deciding to, for the thing she had always been. She reached for the seeing. I felt it seat. I felt the Assay pour it into her, and I felt her body accept the pour. Her bones set like something that had been liquid and was told to be stone. The long cabling of her nerves drew tight and was tuned to a new tension, string by string, until she was strung like a bridge under its first live load. And her sight, her ordinary, unbearable sight that had never switched off, opened all the way. Where before she had read the breaking point of a thing by training and instinct, now she read it by nature, wholly, the fracture in everything laid bare to her, as if the world had been drawn in lines of stress, and she had finally been given the key to the drawing. The carriage steel, the tunnel above, the remade thing lunging at her. She saw the seam in it, the badly rejoined place at the shoulder where the Assay's work had left it weak, as clearly as you see the crack in a plate. She could not yet reach it. She had the sight and not the means, and the thing was on her. Then a wrench the size of a forearm took it through that exact seam, and the shoulder gave, and the Assay came apart along the weakness Joss had named without speaking. The woman holding the wrench was filthy with grease and blood not her own, and grinning in the way people grin when the alternative is to understand what is happening. She had come out of the wrecked service space at the carriage's end, where she had been riding the last train home from a double shift, and she had spent the seconds since the descent doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was keep the machine from killing the people inside it. She had jammed a failing door. She had braced a buckling panel with her own back. She was a transit line mechanic named Nadia Crane, and she looked at the wreck, and she looked at the thing she had just broken, and then she looked at Joss, lying strung and staring in the corner, and said roughly that if Joss could get up, they were not going to die in this corner, because she had felt the wall. Joss got up, and she felt it too, now, with the new sight. What Nadi had felt with a mechanic's hands pressed flat to the tunnel skin. The bore was failing. Not the carriage, the bore itself. The great pressured throat of it beneath a harbor's full weight of water had been part of the Assay's rewriting, and the rewriting had not held. Somewhere ahead the tunnel had been breached, and through the breach, past the folded steel and the swinging dead lamps and the reordered shapes of the people who had argued about a horse, Joss Harrow saw what the sight insisted was impossible. She saw daylight. She saw a sky. There should have been no sky. There should have been only rock and water and the long dark under the sea. But through the wound in the tunnel, a light was coming that was not the light of the descent, and not the light of any morning she had lived under. A sky bleeding slow bands of color it had no right to hold, and beneath it, the shape of a drowned world waiting to be climbed out into. They climbed out of the drowned bore into a country that had been mine for exactly one night, and that I could no longer recognize as anything I was sent to close. The breach opened onto what had been the eastern harbor of Joss Harrow's city. It was there still, in the way a wound is still the arm. The sea had come up the streets and stood in them. Whole avenues lay under still brown water, and out of the water rose the drowned towers of the old world, their windows dark, their signage bleeding rust, and over all of it hung the sky that had no business existing. It bled. There is no other honest word. Slow bands of color drifted across it, oil on water, a bruise that would not settle, and the light that fell from it fell wrong, laying shadows in directions that did not agree with one another. This was the wilds. Land the Assay had rewritten and did not guarantee. Unaudited ground, where the ruins of what a world had been went on swarming with the constructs it had been remade into. I will explain the terms now, since you will need them, and since she learned them faster than an error should have been permitted to. I resent that I must give them to you in her order rather than mine, but her order is the one that survived. There is load. It is the measure of what a thing is worth, which in this world is the same as the measure of what a thing can bear. You will not hear a number from me, because numbers are mine to keep and not hers to know. But understand that Joss Harrow climbed out of that tunnel able to carry more than the woman who had climbed onto the train, in her bones and in her breath, and that she would go on rising because of the second term. There is strain. It is the residue of ending things. It bleeds from the killed and the survived and the solved, and it settles into whoever is standing when the ledger closes on a life, and it is the coin the doomed spend to grow. This is the obscenity at the root of the game, and I say it plainly because it was designed to be said plainly. To become strong enough to live, you must feed on the deaths around you. Joss had already taken a first taste of it in the wreck, when Nadi's wrench opened the remade dock worker and the thing that had been a man came apart. She had felt it settle in her like a swallow of something too strong, and she had not understood it, and she had not refused it either. There is the ward, which I will come to because it is on the horizon and I would spoil the little the two of them had if I named it now. And there are the faults, the rift wounds where the Assay's rewriting tore reality rather than merely rezoning it, where danger pools and reward pools with it, the deep places survivors would learn to enter to grow or to die. Joss saw her first fault without knowing the word for it. 3 streets south, the water was not lying flat. It was turning, slowly, around a place where the drowned district simply stopped being a district and became a throat going down into a color the sky did not have. Noddy looked at it and said they were not going that way. Joss looked at it a moment longer than Noddy did, the way she looked at everything she intended to remember. Then the large one came, and Joss Harrow made her first deliberate kill. And I recorded it with a distaste I have not lost. It rose out of the flooded avenue between them and the higher ground, and it was made of more than one person. The Assay does that when it wants something to hold a street. It takes several and reconciles them into a single asset, tall as a second story, a knot of limbs and reordered bone that moved through the standing water like a waiting tower. Noddy went for the wrench. Joss put a hand on her arm and told her to wait, because Joss was already reading it. She had no power to break a thing with a word. Not yet. What she had was the sight, whole and merciless. And the sight told her that a tower is only ever as strong as the single member that carries its load, and that the Assay, for all its craft, still had to obey that. She looked at the waiting thing and let the fracture lines resolve, and among all the seams the Assay's making had left in it, she found the one that mattered. Low, at the hip, where 3 bodies' worth of frame had been reconciled into one bad joint that bore the whole of the mass above it. Everything the thing was stood on that joint. She did not have the strength to strike it, so she did what she had done her whole working life, which was let weight do the work. She moved, not away, toward, and drew the asset after her onto a slab of collapsed roadway that lay half floating on the flood, an unstable raft of the old world she had read the instant she stepped near it. It followed her onto the slab. Its mass tilted the slab. The tilt loaded the bad joint past what the joint could carry, and at the exact instant the sight told her it would go, Joss drove a length of torn rebar into the seam and let the whole tower's weight finish the crack she had opened. The joint failed. The tower folded down through its own broken hip into the brown water and did not rise. And the strain of 3 reconciled deaths rolled into her at once, and I watched her stagger under the gift of it, and then stand and go on. That is the woman. She did not outfight the Assay's monster. She engineered its fall. Noddy, coming up beside her breathing hard, was already looking past the kill to the thing that would break both of them a little, because Noddy Crane could not walk past a person in the water calling for help, and there was a person in the water calling for help. He was pinned in the drowned mouth of a stairwell, an ordinary man who had survived the descent only to be caught by the old world's own geometry, a fallen beam across his legs and the flood rising the patient inch it had been rising all night. Noddy was in the water before Joss finished telling her the beam would not lift, and Joss went in after her, because she had already decided, in the private ledger she kept that was not mine, that she would not lose the mechanic to the mechanic's own heart. They braced. They heaved. Joss read the beam and knew to the pound what it would take, and knew they did not have it. And she said so, and Noddy swore at her and heaved anyway, and the man's face was very calm by the end, the way the woman with the coffee had been calm. And then the water closed over him, and I drew the line beneath his entry and carried the figure, and it was done. Noddy came out of the water shaking and would not look at Joss. Joss did not offer her anything, because Joss had nothing that was not true. And the true thing was that the world was going to keep doing that. The wilds did not care what you tried. It only counted what you managed. They stood there under the bleeding sky with the dead man's stairwell behind them, and that was the moment the sound came across the drowned city, long and low and deliberate. A horn, blown by no monster, blown by people, organized enough to signal. And far off across the flooded avenues, on the high ground where the water could not reach, a wall of clean white light stood on the horizon, steady where everything else bled, and Joss Harrow looked at it and knew, the way she knew the load in a beam, that human hands had made it, and that human things had gathered behind it, and that it was the first edge of something the Assay itself had allowed to stand. The span had one need it could not audit away, and that need was water. A bridge makes a fine ward, one road, two ends, a long throat of open air that no asset can cross without being seen. But a bridge holds no wells. What the survivors on the span drank came down off the high ground through the old city's intake, a channel of stone and iron that ran beneath the flooded district they had already learned not to say aloud. 3 crews had gone to clear the block in it. I had tallied all 3. None came back up, and I set their sums into the book with the quiet satisfaction of a clerk whose figures behave. Then they sent the woman who reads where things break, and my figures stop behaving. They did not send her because they trusted her. Joss Harrow had come to the span with dirty water still in her boots, and a way of looking at their sealed bridge that told them, without a word, exactly which cable they should pray over. That is a useful thing to have, and a frightening thing to house.
So they gave her the descent, and because they were not fools about how far to trust a stranger who had already appraised their salvation, they gave her a warden to hold the tally beside her, a heavy, careful man named Halloran, who ran the intake in the old world and did not intend to lose it in this one. He did not like her. He was correct not to. She had read his knee the moment he stood, and he had seen her do it. Naughty Crane went down because Joss did not go anywhere Naughty was not. That was already true between them, though neither had said it. There was a girl as well, Senna, young enough that the apocalypse had interrupted an apprenticeship rather than a life, a pump tech who carried the intake's whole map behind her eyes, and was the only reason the crew could find the valve they meant to save. 2 more hands I will not trouble you to remember. I remembered them. It is my office. The mark the Chandler had laid on her at the gate came with them into the dark, and I could feel my master's attention resting on the dive, the way a buyer's hand rests on a thing he has not yet decided to purchase. I will confess I did not like the feeling. A clerk is not meant to notice what the merchant notices. I noticed. The intake carried them down under the high ground and out beneath the drowned district. And there the district stopped being a district. It became a fault. The old exchange had stood at its heart, the great hall where the city had once counted its worth in numbers on a board, and the Assay had folded that hall into a throat descending through a color the sky above did not hold. Marble columns leaned into water that did not move the way water moves. Ledgers floated intact, their ink undissolved, page after ruined page of sums that had meant something the morning before the last. Joss looked at all of it the way she looked at everything now. Not at what it was, but at where it would let go. The assets there had been the people of that hall. The Assay imports nothing. It remakes what it finds. They came out of the flooded galleries pale and reconciled and wrong, and the first of them Joss did not touch at all. She read a landing above it, a slab of stair whose bearing had rotted to a thread, and she put one boot against the balustrade and gave it her weight at the precise place I would have marked, if marking were mine to do. And the landing came down and finished what she had only pointed at. Understand me, she broke nothing by will. She had no such reach yet, whatever the survivors later swore. She saw the fracture, and she spent stone and leverage and the building's own tired load to arrive at it. It was engineering with a monster underneath. It was, I admit, precise past anything I had a column for. Sena found the block where the map said it would be, deep, where the intake narrowed and the exchange's floor had crushed down across the channel and pinched the city's water to a trickle. Halloran wanted to shore it and pump. Joss looked at the crushed floor a long moment and told him it would not be shored, that the slab was carrying the whole gallery above and the whole gallery wanted to fall, and that the only clean water lay on the other side of letting it. She could see the line the fall would take. She could put it where it needed to go, but it would take time to set, and time in a fault is a thing you buy. The price came for them while she worked. It rose from the lower dark, larger than the rest, reconciled from more of the hall's dead than I care to sum. A single grinding weight of a thing that filled the throat and took the light with it. It came for the crew, and the crew broke around it. And in that moment, with the slab half set and the water and the walls and every soul in her keeping hanging on the count, the pressure returned to her. I felt it before she did, because it was my master's hand. One heartbeat, no voice, no list. A pressure shaped exactly like a question. The same opening through which her sight had been drawn into her flesh in the wreck below the sea. It offered her the next thing. It let her feel, for that single beat, that the crack she had set need not wait for her to finish it, that she could speak it and it would run of its own accord, spend itself along the weakness without her hands, if only she paid what such a reaching would cost. She reached. God help me, I watched her reach for it like a woman reading a price on a thing she means to own. And then she did not take it. Whether the cost was more than she had bled to spend, or whether some older stubbornness in her refused to be bought at that price in that hour, I cannot honestly enter into the book. She pulled her hand back from the door the Assay had opened, and she did it the hard way instead. Sena bought her the seconds. The girl put herself in the throat where the weight was coming and jammed the failing valve wheel with her whole body, holding the intake open by main strength so the fall would carry clean. And she was still holding it when Joss set the last of the line and the gallery let go exactly where she had told it to. The exchange came down along its true weakness in a roar that ended the Assay and ended the block and ended Sena in the same breath. I wrote her some. It was not large by the world's new reckoning. It was the largest thing in the room. Noddy went for the girl. Joss went for Noddy and took her down under the shelter of a leaning column, while the water they had come for came through at last, black and cold and alive, surging up the intake toward the span that would drink it and never know the name of the child who opened the valve. Noddy would not look at her afterward. It was the second time. Something in Joss's private ledger closed hard around the two of them and did not open again. A decision, entered without words, that she had already made once and now made permanent. They surfaced with the prize. By nightfall, the span had running water for the first time since the sky changed, and the survivors wept over their taps, and it should have been the end of the fear. But water is wealth, and the Assay had taught a certain kind of man to smell it. Down the flooded avenues, where I keep no ward, and my figures run to men who have learned to make their own. Torches had begun to move toward the light of the bridge, armed, patient, and coming to collect what the drinking would owe. They came to the foot of the bridge and did not try to cross it, and that was the first thing that told me they were not the desperate. The desperate throw themselves at a ward, and I write them down where they fall. These men stopped at the exact line where the Assay's guarantee ended and the flooded avenue began, and they set their torches in the water and waited to be received, because they knew a thing the span was only beginning to learn. A ward keeps out assets. It does not keep out men. I keep no book over the flooded avenues. I had watched these ones grow in my blind places the way rot grows behind a wall, and I knew their sums, and their sums were wrong. They had learned the one truth the Assay would rather its cattle never find: that worth, once a soul has bled and killed and survived enough to earn it, does not simply vanish when that soul is closed. It can be taken. Close a person in the right way, and what they had gathered flows to the one who closed them. A theft the ledger permits because the ledger, at bottom, cares only that the sum lands somewhere. These men had made a trade of it. They found the weak who had scraped together a little worth by living, and they took it and left the husk. They called the taking a toll. I called it, in the privacy of my office, a forgery, and I hated them with the particular hatred a clerk keeps for those who make his figures lie. They had brought proof of their method to the parley. 2 of the span's own foragers, taken on the flooded road a week before and given back now as a courtesy, emptied. They walked and they breathed, and there was nothing behind their eyes but the small habits of a body. Every ounce of what they had earned by surviving drawn out of them and carried off in another man's load. The span looked at its returned people and understood the terms without a word being spoken, which was of course the point of returning them. Their leader did not come. I want that understood because it mattered. Silas Marne sent his voice and kept his person, and a man who can win a bridge by sending his voice is a man who has already counted the room and found he does not need to be in it. The voice he sent was a lean, unhurried man the others called Rusk, who stood at the water's edge with his hands open to show he carried nothing and needed to carry nothing, and who spoke to the span's wardens as a landlord speaks to tenants behind on the rent. Joss stood at the bridge's foot with Halloran on one side and Noddy on the other. Noddy had not slept since the girl. She looked at the 2 hollowed foragers, and something in her went white and still, because she was made to keep things from breaking, and here was a kind of breaking she had no tool for. Joss put a hand at her back, low, where the crowd would not see it, and Noddy did not pull away, and that was the whole of what passed between them, and it was enough to hold Noddy in place. Then Joss saw him. He was standing 3 men back on Rusk's left, thinner than she remembered, and dressed in another man's coat, and for a moment, I confess I lost the thread of my own account, because I had written Emmett Shaw off on night 0 as a berth on a ship that would never sail. He had run for the far shore with her name sold out from under her, and her signature design in a buyer's hands, a whole harbor's road span drawn with her name at the bottom and his over it, and he had booked passage overseas to be gone before she could reach him. The sea had risen up the avenues before his ship could leave the far pier. The grievance that had put her on the last train through the bore had drowned with everything else that used to matter, and here it stood, alive, in a stolen coat, on the wrong side of the water. He saw her see him. I watched it happen. Whatever he had built to survive out there fell off his face all at once, and under it was the same man who had put his name over hers and could not meet her eye across a conference table. And Joss read him the way she read a wall. She did not need her sight for it. She had always been able to find where a person would let go, long before the Assay made it a weapon, and Emmett Shaw was a seam that had never held under load in his life. He stood among the tollmen, and he did not belong to them. He belonged to whoever was winning. She saw the crack in him clear as a plumb line, and she saw exactly what it would be worth to her later, on some day when Marne's certainty needed one loyal man to give way at the hinge. She banked it. That was the thing I did not expect. And my master, I think, did not expect either. She had chased this man across a dying city to name the place where he would break, and now he was in front of her, breakable, and she filed him. She looked at him a half-second longer than was kind, and then she looked away, and left him standing in his fear, which was a crueler thing than killing him,
and a far more useful one. Revenge would have cost her Nadi and the span, and a war she was not yet built to win. She had counted the room, too. She and Marn had that in common, and neither of them knew it yet. Rusk gave them the terms. The span had water now, he said, and water was the only wealth left in the world, and wealth that stands unguarded is simply wealth that has not yet been collected. The span would render a toll, a share of what its people had earned by surviving, paid in worth, bled out of its number the way a tithe is bled from a harvest, and it would render it at each turning of the tide, and in exchange, Marn's men would let the span go on drinking and go on living. Or the span would refuse, and Marn would take the bridge entire, and there would be no share and no tithe, because there would be nothing left to divide. He let the two hollow foragers stand where everyone could see them while he said it. He was a good speaker. I would have hired him. He gave them until the third tide to decide, and the tollmen took up their torches out of the water and went back down the flooded avenue the way they had come, unhurried, a landlord's men who had delivered the notice and had no doubt of the answer. Emmett went with them. He looked back once. Joss did not. The span's wardens fell to arguing before the torches were out of sight, and Halloran's voice was loudest, and none of them were saying the one thing that mattered, which was that a bridge cannot be defended by men who are still deciding whether they are worth defending. Joss stood apart from them at the water's edge, with Nadi silent beside her, looking down the drowned avenue where the light of the toll was shrinking into the dark. And I felt my master's attention settle on her again, not on the threat, but on her, on the way she had held a killing in her hand and chosen to keep it. As though restraint were a figure it had been waiting to see whether she could write. The third tide was 2 days out. In 2 days, the span would have to become something that could refuse, or it would be emptied like its foragers and its water drunk by another man's throat. And there was only one person on that bridge who had spent her whole life being paid to know exactly how much load a failing structure could bear before it had to be made to bear more. She let the wardens argue until the argument had exhausted itself, which did not take long, because men who are deciding whether they deserve to live make a poor and circular noise. Then she stepped into the middle of it and told them the truth she had been paid her whole life to tell, which is that nothing is saved by being loved. A structure is saved by knowing where its load will go and putting something under it before it goes there. The word for that, in the trade she had come from, is to underpin. You do not tear down the failing thing, and you do not rule it. You get beneath it, and you hold. That was the whole of her speech, and it should not have worked. And it did not work because of her. It worked because Nadi Crane, who had not spoken since the girl in the fault, stood up beside her and said, in a voice that still had the grief in it, that she was tired of watching people be emptied, and that she would rather die holding something up than live being drained, and that anyone who felt the same could come and stand with them. And they came, not for Joss. They would never quite come for Joss. She read them too accurately, and people know when they have been read. They came for Nadi, because Nadi believed it and made it possible to believe. And by the time the tide turned once, there was a thing on that bridge that had not existed the day before and had a name. They called it the underpin. I entered the name into my book with a hand that was no longer entirely steady, because a lone error is one line and I can cross out a line, but a structure with a name is a change to the account, and I was no longer sure the account was mine. Joss became its spine and Nadi its heart, and neither of those is a metaphor. Joss decided what would hold. Nadi made the holding worth doing. Between them, the two functions were one load-bearing thing. and everything the underpin would ever become rested on the join between them. Which is why, when I tell you what happened next, I want you to understand that she knew exactly what she was spending. For she had also done the other arithmetic, the cold one, the one she kept in her private book where I could not read the margins. Marnie would come across the flooded approach at the third tide, and the flooded approach was not as flooded as it looked. There was a drowned causeway out there under the brown water, an old pumping annex and its raised road, and at low tide it stood clear enough to march a column across, dry-shod, straight to the foot of the bridge. As long as that causeway stood, the span could not be defended. Marnie had a road to its throat, and the causeway could be denied. She had walked its length in her mind and found the 3 places where the old annex carried its own weight on rot. And she knew that if those 3 places were opened at once, the whole raised road would sit down into the harbor and give Marne nothing but water to drown in. The difficulty was that the causeway was not empty. It never had been. The span's ward held only so many, and the overflow, the ones there had been no room for inside the guarantee, had made their camp out along the annex because it was the only dry ground close enough to run from. Hundreds of them. And there were 2 days, and there were not enough hands or hours to bring all of them in across a single choked bridge before the tide that Marne would come on. She did the sum, and the sum did not balance, and she made it balance the only way a demolition sum ever balances, which is by deciding what falls. She would bring in as many as could be brought, and then, before the tide gave Marne his road, she would drop the causeway with whoever was still on it, because the many inside the ward could not be saved while the road to their throat stood open. And a woman who has spent her life dropping structures knows that the cruelest lie in the trade is that everything can be held. I will not pretend she did it with a spoken word and a flick of the hand. She had no such power then, whatever the survivors later swore of her, and I, who kept the true account, will not let the legend stand. She read the 3 rotten places, and she sent Noddy's mechanics to cut and pack them exactly where she marked. And while they worked, I felt her brush again at the thing she was not yet able to seize, the opening, the pressure shaped like a question, the sense that a crack such as this need not be labored into being, but could simply be told to run. She did not take it. She could not have paid for it. She did it with iron and leverage and the annex's own tired weight, the honest, slow way. And the honest, slow way is the one that leaves you standing on the shore long enough to watch. They brought in as many as they could. It was not most of them. When the tide began to draw down and the causeway began to show itself dry, and Marne's first torches appeared far out along it, Joss gave the word, and the 3 rotten places opened along the lines she had read, and the raised road folded down into the harbor along its true weakness, and took the water and the torches and the ones who had not run in time. The approach was gone. The span was defensible. And Noddy stood at the rail and watched the brown water close over the place where the camp had been, and she did not scream, and she did not accuse. She only looked at Joss with the girl in the fault still in her eyes, and now this on top of it, and said nothing, and turned away. It was the 3rd time. The join between the spine and the heart did not break. But I marked, that night, the first hairline in it, and I noted that the woman who founded the underpin to keep things from being emptied had begun the keeping by emptying a causeway of her own, and that the power was not making her cruel, so much as it was rewarding the part of her that had always been willing. My master watched her do it. I felt the chandler's attention rest on her the whole while, patient as a weight,
Not on the causeway and not on Marn, but on her, on whether she could carry a choice like that and go on standing. As though the load itself were the appraisal. As though it had all along been measuring not what she could break, but what she could bear. She stood on the defended bridge with the approach drowned, and Marn turned back for a season. And she was not relieved, because she had done the last of the arithmetic and knew that all she had bought was time. Denying the road did not beat Marn. Marn's men were strong the way thieves are strong, fat on the worth they had drained from 100 emptied throats, and the Span's people were thin, and thin cannot hold against fat forever no matter how well it underpins. To match him, the underpin would need worth of its own, real worth, the kind the Assay did not give away, the kind it hoarded in the deep places behind its greatest assets. And the nearest and richest of those deep places, 3 streets south where the flood turned slowly around a throat descending into a color the sky did not hold, was a fault anchored by a single linchpin thing, a keystone that held the whole rift together, from which no crew that had ever gone down had ever come back up. To break the man no one could refuse, she would have to break the thing no one could survive. By my arithmetic, the sensible course was to hold the bridge and starve. Defense costs less than assault. A warden who fortifies and waits will, across a long enough tally, outlast a raider who must spin to take. I had already entered the span in my ledger as a slow subtraction, a column that would dwindle, tide upon tide, as Marn bled it, until there was nothing left to weigh. It was a clean projection. I confess I was fond of it. It required nothing of me but patience, and patience is the one virtue a clerk is permitted. The Harrow woman did the same arithmetic and read it the way she read everything, for where it broke. Defense only delayed. To match the worth Marn had wrung out of hollowed men, the coalition she had propped up needed worth of its own, and worth pooled in the faults like water finding the low place. The nearest and the richest of them the warden spoke of only to say no crew came back. They had a name for it, taken from the great fused thing at its root, the load-bearer that held the whole wound together. The cornerstone. She heard the word, and I watched her file it the way she filed a building marked for demolition. Not with dread, only with the question of the charge. They went down under the drowned courthouse at the harbor's old civic heart, where the sea had torn the foundations open into a throat of stone and bad light. A dozen of them, underpin volunteers with cutting tools and packed charges, knotty at the woman's shoulder with the wrench that had killed the first asset she ever met. I do not enjoy recording that the mechanic went. Her warmth is a thing my ledger cannot price, and it made the descent read wrongly on my page, a warm number where there should have been only cold. They climbed down through galleries that had been courtrooms, past benches furred with salt, into a dark the sky above does not permit, and I sharpened my pen, because a keystone is where my accounts are meant to balance. It is where candidates break. The cornerstone stood where the building's true stone had once been set, a titan grown from masonry and the courthouse's dead, fused into one load-bearing thing, its spine the pillar that held the fault's whole ceiling from falling in. The woman looked up at it, and her fracture sight opened all the way, and I felt, as I always did now, the small, obscene intimacy of it. She saw the flaw. Every made thing has one, and hers is the eye that finds it. The seam ran up the Titan's spine into a core buried where no arm could reach and no charge could be seated. She had the wound. She simply had no way to put her hand in it. So she did what she always did. She fought it with weight and leverage and the honest, slow craft of bringing a structure down. And for the first time in her life, the craft was not enough. every crack her people opened with steel, the cornerstone closed. It was the keystone. The fault fed it. It re-knit faster than a dozen mortals could cut. And it did not tire. And it began, without haste, to take them apart. A woman went into the dark and did not come up. Then a man, folded against a bench. The volunteers scattered into the galleries, and the Titan followed, unhurried, a thing correcting an error. And it drove the Harrow woman back until her heel found the edge of the rift, and there was nowhere further to give. And there it was again, the thing that had come to her twice before and been refused. Not a voice, not a menu, a single heartbeat of pressure shaped like a question. An opening held out for exactly as long as it took her heart to beat once. An invitation to draw a new capacity into the flesh. She had brushed it in the flooded exchange and turned from it. She had brushed it on the drowning causeway and paid the honest cost instead. It offered her a crack she would not have to labor into being, a fracture she could simply tell to run. The last 2 times she had judged the price too high. This time the price was standing over her, taking her people one at a time, and she had run out of the slow way. She took it. I felt the seating open the way I had felt the first one, except that this time my pen did not tremble. This time my hand stopped altogether. She looked up the Titan's spine at the seam she could see and could not reach, and she named it, not aloud, or not only aloud, but with the whole of the new thing seated in her, and the fracture ran. It went up the spine on its own like a fault line finding daylight, into the buried core, and then everywhere at once, faster than the fault could feed the healing, and the cornerstone came apart along its weakness in a single spreading breath. 10,000 tons of fused stone and the courthouse's dead let go of the shape that had held them, and the load-bearer of the whole wound was simply gone. I should have been recording the balance. Instead, I recorded what it cost her, because I could see it and she could not. When she spoke the break, something in her answered it. The same seam the power reads in everything, run for 1 instant through her own core. And a small human thing went quiet in her and did not come back. A hairline. The capacity to be slowed by a death. The part that had once tried to save a pinned man in a drowned stairwell. It did not shatter. It cracked, the way the first stone of a long collapse cracks, and I understood with a clerk's cold certainty that this was the first payment on a debt she had not read the whole of. And far off, at the edge of my attention where the chandler keeps its patient watch, I felt it be pleased. Because a keystone is where its candidates are meant to break, and she had broken the keystone instead, and that was precisely the worth it had been measuring all along. Not what she could shatter, what she could bear to lose of herself to do it. Then the fault, with nothing left to anchor it, peeled open downward. The floor of the wound sheared away beneath the settling dust, and the drowned bedrock under the drowned city fell inward. And for the space of a long breath, the dark below stood exposed all the way down. And there, far beneath everything, I saw the thing I had been dreading since the descent began. The thing my office does not let me pretend I do not know. A shape of light going up out of the deep, floor upon floor. And as she watched, gripping the mechanic's arm at the rim of the ruin she had made, a new floor set itself into place with a sound like a struck bell. The reckoning spire, growing, and every floor of it, I knew, and she was only beginning to guess, is a mark struck off toward the day the appraisal completes and the earth is spent. and it was counting down. She came up out of that ruin with the worth she had gone down for, and a new thing seated in her hands. And she did not wait for Marnie's next tide. That was the moment the account changed past my mending. A warden who fortifies and waits was a column I knew how to close. A woman who had just watched a countdown set itself into the deep and decided the arithmetic no longer favored patience was something my office has no form for. She went to him. She carried the war into the flooded avenues, the low, drowned streets the tollmen held precisely because they are the places my audit does not reach, my blind country, and she broke them open one district at a time. She no longer needed weight and leverage in packed charges. She would look at a barricade the forgers had raised across a sunken street, and she would name its seam, and the seam ran, and the thing came apart along its weakness as though it had only ever been waiting for her permission. She spoke to a held building, and it let go of its own corners. I had spent 900 worlds trusting the one honest premise of my trade, that a made thing stays made until something with mass and time takes it down. She had made a lie of that premise, and each time she did it, I felt again the cold that had stopped my hand at the seating, that I was no longer watching an error in my ledger, but something my ledger was never built to hold. I will use the plain word, since I have earned it. I was afraid. Silas Marne had held his men the way a good clerk holds a room, by counting it and never needing to be in it. So she took the room out from under him. She took his avenues until he had none left to count from, no held street to send his voice out of, no forger's remove to stand behind, until at the last she had left him a single flooded square with his own name still chalked on it, and he had to come and stand in it himself. I had never once seen Silas Marne. Neither, I think, had most of the men who had died carrying his toll. He was smaller than his voice, a spare, still man with a bookkeeper's flat eyes, swollen faintly under the skin with all the worth he had wrung out of hollowed people, a hoard he wore like a second body. He did not try to outbreak her. He had watched her long enough to know he could not. He went instead for the one place a structure carries its whole weight. He took the mechanic. I record it as I saw it. He held Knotty Crane at the low edge of the square where the water stood black, and he offered the woman the only trade he had left. Stand down, unmake nothing more of his, or he would close her friend where she knelt. And for the first time since the seating, the error's terrible new capacity was of no use to her at all. Because the one thing she could not yet do was tell a fracture to run and trust it to stop exactly where she wanted. And the gift was still new and wide in her hands, and Knotty was too close. She could have cracked any man in that square. She could not crack this one. So she was held, and Marne, who had felt for the seam in her the whole patient time and finally found it, began to press it. He drew the closing out slow, to break her spine by making her watch it happen. And I set it down truthfully. It very nearly worked. He had located the single lever that made the error hesitate, and a thing that hesitates can be closed. She had, in an earlier tide, looked across the flooded exchange at a thin man in a stolen coat standing among the tollmen, a man who had once set his name over hers on a drawing of a road span across the harbor mouth, and sold it, and booked a berth on a ship he never sailed. And she had read him the way she reads everything, and found the seam. A loyalty that had never held under load. She had not spent it then. She had banked it. She spent it now, and she did not lift a hand to do so. She had only to let Emmett Shaw perform the one sum he had always been best at, which was to feel which way the weight was falling. He saw Marnie losing. He saw that to stand beside Marnie now was to be entered in the same closing column. And Emmett, who had never in his life chosen anything but the cheaper exit, chose it a final time. He put a blade into the one man in that square who had trusted the tollman to hold. And Marnie fell, not to the woman who had broken his whole world, but to the smallest, most ordinary treachery left standing in it. There was no redemption in the act. There was only a rat reading a sinking hull. The worth Marnie had forged out of all those emptied people had to land somewhere. The ledger cares only that the sum comes to rest. But Emmett had struck in blind self-preservation, not in the deliberate cruelty by which the toll is taken, and so it did not transfer. It spilled. It scattered off the page uncollectible, and I confess a clerk's small, mean satisfaction to watch a forger's entire hoard vanish where no one could enter it. A lie in my books, finally erasing itself. The mechanic came away whole in her body. Something between the two of them did not. Naughty Crane had knelt at the edge of the black water and watched her oldest friend stand cold and reckoning with a life held at the point of closing, and reach, not for the wrench she carried, not toward Naughty at all, but for the arithmetic. It was the fourth hairline in the join, and this one the woman had put there herself, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it. She stayed. She always stayed. But afterward the woman looked at her friend a half-second longer than she used to, the way you look at a bridge you are no longer entirely sure of, measuring a thing you love for the load it can still bear. And into that silence, at the far edge of the drowned square, something that had watched the whole of this account from its first entry finally chose to be seen. It stepped out of the place where my master keeps its patience, and it did the one thing I have never known it to do for any candidate on any of the 900 worlds I have closed. It congratulated her, courteous and ancient and pleased past all its hiding. The chandler came to tell the error in my ledger that she had passed a test she had not known was being set, and that the true measure had never once been what she could break. It was what she had just shown herself willing to lose. It stood across the black water where Marn had fallen, and it spoke to her as though the whole drowned square were a drawing room. And I stood at my master's shoulder the way a clerk stands, hating every moment I was near enough to be noticed. It had waited a long time to say these things. It said them gently, the way you tell a child a hard thing. And I set them down as I always do. And this once, I wished I did not have to. It told her what it was. It was a merchant of worlds. It walked out among the far dark and found worlds the way a chandler finds tallow, for what could be rendered from them. And it appraised each one, and the ones worth the burning it lit. My master does not conquer worlds, it spends them. It sets a world alight at one end and warms itself at the flame and lets the thing gutter down to nothing, and when the wick is gone, it walks on to the next. And it has done this for so long that it no longer remembers the name of the first candle it ever struck. I have closed 900 of those burnings. I had never, until that square, heard it name the trade aloud. It does not, it said, attend the burnings in person. That is what the assay is for. The apparatus, the audit, the harvest. It need never leave its counting house at all. It walks a condemned world's ruin in the flesh it wears, for one reason only. When it scents, across all that dark, the rarest thing it hunts, a soul that might be made to hold what it holds, it comes to see for itself. And it had come here.
I set that down exactly as it said it, and I will not pretend I know whether it was true or only another of its courtesies. But if it was true, then this whole world's burning. My 4 million entries, every name I have crossed and every name I have yet to cross, was in some part merely the price of a single woman it had come across the dark to appraise. She heard that. She did not flinch. She only filed it the way she files everything, and I understood that she had already half known. And then it said the first plain thing I ever heard my master say. It was old past its own reckoning, and it was tired. It had held its office too long. World upon world, it hunted not for tribute, but for someone it could at last hand the weight to.
That was the courtship.
Inherit the ledger, the book that is not a book, the throne that runs the whole game, the office of appraisal itself. If she could climb the reckoning spire to its summit and prove, floor by rising floor, that she was fit to bear it. Rule everything, it offered her, in the place of a merchant grown too weary to go on. And the proving ground was already there, already growing at the drowned heart of her city, one struck bell floor at a time. She looked at it the way she looks at a bridge she means to bring down. I felt that look land, and I flinched for my master, because I had seen where that look leads. She was reading it for its load-bearing point, the seam that holds the whole courteous shape of it together. And I do not think she found it yet, but she looked, and something in me went cold at how unafraid the looking was. Then she gave it the only answer she had. She would not be a piece. She would not climb a tower because the thing that built it wanted her to. She would not be moved across a board and call it a choice. Whatever she did at that spire, she would do because she chose the doing, and not one step of it as a favor to the merchant that had burned her world down to fetch her. She did not say the rest of it, but the rest of it stood at her back all the same, in the shape of the coalition she had propped up and the one friend inside it she had lately looked at a half-second too long. That was what she was refusing on behalf of. That was the load she meant to keep. And my master, I had never seen it do this either, smiled. Because that was the answer it had been listening for. The ones who reach for the ledger have always been the ones unfit to hold it. A thing that wants the throne will close its hand on the throne and be crushed by it. The only hands that can bear the office are the hands that refuse it. Her refusal was not a wall against the courtship. Her refusal was the worth. She had passed again by declining to compete, and the chandler was pleased the way a man is pleased to find, at the bottom of a very long ledger, that the sums have finally come out right. I must confess here the thing that had been happening to me across the whole of this account, and that happened past all my denying in that drowned square. I am a clerk of the Assay. My duty is the tally, and for 900 worlds my loyalty was absolute. But I am also bound to this world, chained to its book, made to stand in its ruin and cross out its 4 million names one by one until the flame takes the last of them. And standing there, hearing my master call itself tired, hearing it lay its whole game before a woman who had just looked it in the face and said no, I felt a thing move in me that has no line in any ledger I keep. I began, quietly and treasonously, and I could not stop it, to hope that the error wins, that she does the one thing none of the 900 could, that she climbs my master's tower and breaks the counting house and leaves my book unfinished forever. I am not permitted to want that. I set it down anyway, because it is true. I wanted it. And as though it had heard me, and I have never learned the limit of what my master hears, the countdown answered. Far below the ruined square, down in the deep where the reckoning spire climbs out of the drowned bedrock, a floor set itself into place. And then, before the bell of it had finished ringing, another and another. The appraisal, which had grown patient and slow, began to hurry. My master had found its heir, or found the thing that would prove whether it had one, and it saw no further reason to wait. When that tower tops out, the wick of this world burns to its end, and the earth is rendered down to whatever warmth it is worth. And the count, which for so long had crept, had just begun to run. The merchant had stopped being patient, and everything I had watched her build to survive a slow burning began, all at once, to fail. Because a slow burning was the only kind of thing it had ever been made to survive. The span had held for one reason. The world was being spent slowly enough that honest engineering and a wall of wards could keep pace with the spending. When the count in the deep began to run, the pace broke. The faults spread faster than any bridge could be built to close them. The wards thinned, and the worst of the pent things, which the slow burn had kept penned, came out together. A new fault tore open at the very foot of the span, and out of it came more than her defenses had ever been weighed to hold. A keystone of the cornerstone's terrible kind at the head of it, and behind that, a flood of lesser assets, and behind that, the water rising through the guttering wards. She met it the way she now met everything. She named a seam, and the seam ran, and a thing came apart, and she named another, and another. But her gift, for all its terror, was a precise and singular thing. She could break anything she could see and reach. She could not break everything at once, and everything at once was exactly what came. So the arithmetic she had always done in cold blood did the only thing it could do. It chose. It could not hold the span and empty it both. It could hold the far end long enough to get the people off, or keep the bridge and lose them where they stood. There was no third column, and she had never in her life pretended there was. Halloran held the far end. He had never trusted her. He had ceded command only because the tide had left him no better option, and he had spent every day since watching her become a thing he had no name for and did not like. And when the choosing came, it was Halloran, an old water warden with a warden's flat stubbornness and not one of her terrible gifts, who put himself at the mouth of the new fault where the worst of it poured through and held it, so that the crossing behind him could empty toward the shore. He held it far longer than a man without her gifts had any right to hold anything. And then it took him. The last act of the man who had distrusted her from the first was to buy, with his own closing, the exact fistful of seconds she needed to save the rest of what she had built. I entered him in the book. I did not want to. I am running out of things I want to do. With the far end held and the people streaming off toward the shore, she did the thing that only she could do, and the thing it cost her the most to do, because it was hers. She looked at the bridge she had engineered and defended and made against every odd into a home, and she named its seam, and she told the fracture to run. Her own span came down into the black water. It took the fault's mouth with it, and the flood pouring out of that mouth, and it sealed the wound in the world with its own ruin. She spent the thing she had built to stop the thing that would have spent everyone standing on it. It was, I understood even as it fell, the throne's whole logic rendered small, the bearer who saves the sum by choosing, in cold blood, what to lose. And somewhere at the far edge of it all, my master was well pleased. But she could not clear the bridge fast enough, because the merchant had left her no time. Not everyone was off it when she brought it down. Naughty Crane was still on it. She had gone back. Of course she had gone back. She was the heart of the thing, and the heart goes back. For someone slower than herself, and she was still out on the span when the fracture ran through it. They pulled her out of the black water afterward, and I will grant this much to whatever thin mercy runs this cruel arithmetic.
She lived. But part of her stayed under the bridge. She came out broken in ways that would never fully mend, marked for the rest of her life by the collapse her oldest friend had chosen. And every soul in that coalition saw that the woman who led it had brought her own bridge down with her own heart still standing on it. She lived. She was never again the whole person who had walked out onto that span. And here is the thing that undid me to watch. Naughty Crane did not turn on her. She understood the math. She had always understood the math, better than anyone alive except the woman herself. And she knew, broken as she was, that the choice had saved 100 where sentiment would have lost them all. She did not turn. But something between them had reached the very last of what a join can bear and still hold. The woman had built her whole coalition on a single true friendship, and then spent that friendship's body to keep the coalition breathing. And both of them knew it, and neither of them said it, and the not saying was the widest thing that had ever stood in the space between them. She had become, in plain fact and no longer in threat, a bearer who spends what she loves to save the sum. She was becoming, in other words, exactly fit to inherit the ledger. And I, who had begun, against all my oaths, to hope she might win, understood for the first time what her winning might cost her to become, and I no longer knew what it was I hoped for. The span was gone. The wards had guttered out. The faults were spreading now faster than any bridge could ever be built to close them, and the count in the deep ran on and did not slow for grief or for anything. There was nowhere left to stand and hold a line. And the woman who had spent the whole of her life building things and defending things and holding the line for the people at her back turned, for the first time in all of this account, away from every one of them. She did not look for what she could hold. She looked up, at the reckoning spire climbing out of the drowned dark, floor upon rising floor toward its unfinished summit. And she began, at last, to think not of defending anything at all, but of climbing that tower to the top and bringing the whole game down from there. There was no other move left on the board. And my master, I have come to think, had always known there would not be. She did not call it a retreat, though that is what the shore was. I have watched 900 worlds decide, in their last hours, whether to die facing the wall or facing the open door, and I had already filed this one under the wall. Then Josephine Harrow turned her back on everything she had spent a season shoring up, and walked her scattered people down toward the drowned heart of the city, toward the one structure I was certain would finish them, and I found, to my own disgrace, that I did not want to be right. What was left of the underpin was not much. The span was gone, its wards had guttered, its people were strung along the tide line in wet, waiting knots, needing to be told a thing worth doing. Joss could not have told them. Joss had never been the reason they stayed, but Naughty Crane could still be moved, broken as she was in ways that would never fully set, part of her left for good under a bridge her friend had brought down, and she made them carry her forward instead of back. She was still the only warm thing on that whole cold shore, and where she went, they went. She went toward the spire. So the last of the world I had been condemning walked, of its own will, into the mouth of the thing built to render it down. The drowned heart was worse below than it had looked from the shore. The sea stood brown and deep and still over the roofs of the old courts and exchanges, and out of the black under all that water the spire climbed. I have no better word for it than climbing. Floor set upon floor of hard light, each arriving with that struck bell sound I had learned to dread, and now the bells did not finish. One would still be ringing in the water when the next floor set above it and began its own toll. The count that had once measured this world in patient decades was spending it in hours, because the chandler had found what it came to find and had stopped being patient. Far above waited an unfinished summit. When it finished, so did the earth. Joss looked up at it the way she looked at everything now, for where it would come apart. The lower floors were the Assays, and the Assay filled them. Its assets came down the light in numbers I will not pretend I enjoyed tallying. The old cities dead, reconciled, and re-poured into the stair against her. And here was the thing I had come to fear. She barely slowed. She had stopped cutting long ago. Now she only spoke. She would name a seam in the swarm, a joint, a load line, the one failing thing a mass of them leaned upon, and the fracture would run on its own, everywhere at once, and a whole floor of the Assay's work would come down its own weakness in a single breath. But I had learned where the fracture failed her, and so had she. A thing she names comes apart along its weakness, and it does not always stop where she means it to. On the third floor, a fracture she sent into a pillar of assets ran too far, into the floor her own people stood upon, and the light gave, and some of them went down into the dark beneath the spire and did not come up. She did not stop for it. That was the part I could not look away from. A season ago, she had tried to save a single man pinned under a stair and had been slowed for days by failing him. Now, she stepped over the gap she herself had opened, counted who was left, and went up. The mercy that had cracked in her at the cornerstone had not grown back. She was becoming, floor by floor, exactly the kind of hand that could hold the office the chandler meant to give her. One that spends what it loves and does not slow. I had begun, weeks before, to hope this error would win. To hope she would break the counting house and leave my book unfinished forever. Watching her step over her own dead on that floor, I no longer knew whether I hoped she would reach the top or that something would stop her before she got there. On the fifth floor, the chandler's champion was waiting. It was a keystone, the second she had faced, and it had been made to hold the whole lower spire the way the cornerstone had held its fault. A great architecture of light and welded dead, its spine the pillar the floors above it leaned on. She did to it what had broken the first one, named the seam up its core and let the fracture run. And the seam knit shut behind the running crack faster than the crack could travel, the light pouring back into every break as fast as she opened it. Because this thing was not merely strong, this thing had a rule. By the law of the place it was unbroken, and the law mended it faster than her power could part it. Propagation, which had made her terrible, met the one thing it could not do. It could break anything that was allowed to break, and this had been told it was not. She was cornered then, her fracture sliding off a thing that refused to stay cut, and she did what she had not known she could do. She stopped looking at the champion's shape. She had spent her whole life reading where a structure fails. Now, with nowhere to go, she looked underneath the structure, past the welded dead and the pillar of light to the thin, cold sentence holding all of it in the shape of a thing that could not break. And for one instant, she read that instead. Not the crack in the wall, the rule that said the wall was whole. She reached for it the way she reaches for a seam, meaning to speak, and something in the champion stuttered, forgot itself. For a single heartbeat, the law let go, the light stopped pouring back, and the fracture she had already set caught and held and ran into a thing that an instant before had been unbreakable, and the keystone came apart down its whole spine. She did not do it again. She could not have. I do not think she yet knew what she had touched. She had not undone the rule. She had brushed it, felt it flinch, and been let past for one breath by something larger than herself that chose, for its own reasons, to blink. What frightened her was not that it worked. It was what she had felt on the far side of that sentence, that a rule, like a wall, has a place where it bears its own weight, that a law can be read for where it breaks, and that to speak there would cost her something whose price she had not finished counting, the way the last tear had quietly taken her mercy. She stood over the fallen champion with her hands shaking, and not from the fight. My pen, which had trembled the night she ceded her first power and stopped altogether at her second, would not touch the page at all. I have no column for a thing that reads the law it is written under. Above the ruined keystone the light changed. The Assay's floors ended at a threshold, a seam of brighter nothing between everything she had climbed and the tall floors above, where the summit waited, where the throne waited. What was left of her people gathered at her back, fewer than had come down into the drowned heart, naughty among them, held upright by will and by the two who would not set her down. Joss put her hand to the threshold to open it the way she opened everything, and the chandler was standing in it. It had not come as an asset. It came as it always came to her, courteous, unhurried, a shape wearing the manners of a man, and it raised no hand against her. It only stood in the one doorway she needed, in no apparent hurry at all, with the patience of a thing that had already spent 900 worlds and could well afford to spend an evening. It told her she had climbed very well. It told her she had broken the thing that could not be broken, which no candidate before her had done. And it said, with the terrible gentleness I had come to know, that before she went up she was owed, as the only hand it had ever found that might truly bear the office, to be told plainly what that office would cost her, while she still had a self left to spend on the hearing. Then it began to tell her. It told her the truth, the way a man tells a debt to someone he has decided he likes, plainly and without hope of being forgiven for it. The throne she had climbed toward, the ledger, the office that runs the whole apparatus, the pillar every world the Assay has ever spent leans upon, is not a crown. It is a load. Whoever sits it takes up the weight of the count entire and holds it and does not put it down. Not for a war, not for a life, not for an age. The one who bears the ledger bears every world at once, forever. And to hold a thing that heavy, you cannot remain a creature that can be crushed by it. So the office burns out of you, slowly and wholly, everything in you that could be crushed. It takes your place in time first. The holder steps out of the current the rest of us are carried on. Centuries pass over them like a held breath. They cannot age beside anyone, cannot keep pace with a single mortal life, because a mortal life begins and ends in what is, to them, one afternoon. Then it takes the thing beneath that, the capacity to be slowed by a death, the capacity to be moved at all, the part of you that would stop for one person. A load-bearer who stops is a load-bearer who has dropped the world, and so that part is not permitted to stay. I had called the chandler a monster in these pages, and it is one, but I had not understood what kind. It was not describing a prize it guarded. It was describing a prison it had been kept in for longer than I have numbers to hold, and it was reciting the terms of its own parole. It had sat the ledger once,
to spare something, I gathered, though it did not say what, and I did not ask, being only the clerk. And it had borne the weight ever since, across the 900 worlds I have watched it spend, and the many more before my time. Hollowed of everything a person is, until nothing was left but courtesy and tiredness, and the long, patient hunt for a replacement. It does not spend worlds because it is cruel. It spends them looking. Every burning is a net cast for the one soul that might at last lift the load from its shoulders and let it lie down and end. It was not offering Joss a throne. It was a thing so tired it had forgotten the shape of rest, asking her, very gently, to be its relief. And now I understood the riddle it had smiled at, back in the flooded square when she refused it, and I could not see why refusal pleased it. Only a hand that refuses can bear the office, because the office is paid for with the self, and anyone who grasps at it grasps to become something, deathless, a god over the count. Such a one will not pay the self, since the self is the whole reason they reached, so the office crushes them, because they have come to keep being someone while holding a thing that permits no one to remain. Every candidate the Chandler had ever courted lost for that same reason, and it was not weakness. It was that none of them had been willing to lose themselves. They wanted the crown and their own faces both, and the ledger cannot be worn by anyone who insists on keeping a face. Joss listened to all of it without moving, and I watched her do the thing she does, the thing that frightens me more than any power she has seated. She read it. Not the Chandler, the shape of the whole game, laid out at last like a span she had been asked to survey. She saw the pillar and what it cost to be the pillar. She saw that to stop the burning of her world, someone would have to take up the count and hold it, and that the someone could be her, and that the price would be everything by which a living soul would ever know her to be Joss Harrow. She saw the two doors the Chandler was, in its terrible kindness, holding open for her. Take the office and spare the world and cease, or refuse the office and keep herself, and let the world go into the flame like the 900 before it. Here is the thing I have dreaded to write, the confession this whole testimony has been walking toward. I had come to hope she would break the counting house. When the price was named, I understood what I should have been hoping instead, that she would refuse, take her ruined people and her one warm friend, walk back down into what was left of her drowning world, and simply lose, humanly, the way the honest lose, because I know her ledger, even if I cannot read its margins. And I could see the arithmetic she was working, and I could see that it came out the wrong way. She has been training for this price the entire climb. She let her mercy crack at the cornerstone and did not mourn it. She spent her friend's own body to save the sum and lived with it. She stepped over her own dead on the 5th floor and counted who was left. She is the one candidate in 900 worlds who might truly be willing to lose herself, because she has been paying herself out in installments the whole way. And she had already decided, I saw her decide it, that a self is a fair price for a world. That is what I fear most. Not that the error will lose, that she will win by becoming the very thing I have been begging the dark to unseat. She did not tell them any of it. She turned from the Chandler and from the open threshold and looked back down the last floors at the handful of people still standing there, fewer every floor, and at Naughty Crane in the middle of them, held upright by will and by two who would not set her down, that ruined, stubborn, warm woman who had followed her out of a wrecked tunnel and into the mouth of the end, and who would, if Joss let her, follow her up into the office itself. And Joss did not let her. She sent them back. She made no speech of it. She has never made a speech of anything.
She said the floors above were hers to survey and no one else's, which was true, and that the way down was clear now, which was also true, and she said nothing whatever about what she had just been told the top would cost, because to say it would have been to invite Noddy to argue, and Noddy would have argued, and Noddy would have lost, and Joss would not spend her friend's last strength on a losing argument. Whatever passed between the two of them then passed in the margins I cannot read. A look, I think, and something small handed over or handed back. I have watched this world's every closing, and I could not tell you which. I can tell you only that Noddy did not turn from her, even now, even knowing where she was going and why, and that Joss carried whatever it was up the last floors alone, and that it was the final human thing left in her, and she meant to keep it there for exactly as long as a load-bearer is permitted to keep anything, which is not long. Then the threshold took her. The seam of brighter nothing closed behind her, like a page turning, and her people and her friend were on the far side of it, going down toward a shore and a life, and Joss Harrow went up alone into the tall floors, toward the unfinished summit where the bells were setting one atop another now, with no pause between them at all, toward the throne that waited to be filled and the tired thing that waited to be let down. I went with her, being chained to her book and having no say in it. I would have gone anyway. I did not want her to climb the last of it with no witness but the Chandler, and I no longer knew whether I followed her to see her win or to be there when the Count, at the very top of everything, at last closed her name. The tall floors were not like the ones below. Nothing came down the light to meet her. No assets, no champions. The Assay had spent all of that in the gauntlet, and what remained above the ruined keystone was only height, and brighter nothing, and the bells. They set now with no pause at all, one striking before the last had stopped, a peal folding into a peal into a peal, the Count spending the last of my world as fast as it could ring. She climbed through it alone, and I climbed with her, chained to the book she was carrying up toward the place the book was kept. At the top was a floor that had not finished. It was the highest the spire had raised, and its far edge still hung open onto the deep dark where the next mark waited to set and end everything. The summit, all but complete, one bell from the harvest. This was the reckoning floor. And in the middle of it, patient as a thing that has waited across 900 worlds and can outwait one more evening, stood the Chandler, beside the throne it had climbed all that way to be rid of. I cannot describe the ledger. It was not a chair. It was the place the weight of every world comes to rest, made visible for the length of an offer. A seat shaped like the bottom of everything, and to look at it was to feel how much it would ask of whoever sat there, and how it would never ask again once it had them. The Chandler stood beside it with the manners it always wore, and it did the only thing it knew to do with a soul who had climbed this high. It offered her the seat. It told her the world below was one bell from the flame, and that the seat could halt the flame, and that this was the whole of what it had ever wanted, for a soul able to bear the load to take it up, and spare the world, and let the tired thing that had borne it so long lie down at last. It expected her to sit. Every soul who had ever reached this floor had reached for the seat. That is what reaching so high is for. Joss did not reach for the seat. She stood on the unfinished floor with the bells folding over one another and the dark hanging open at the edge. And she did the thing she had done her whole life to bridges and buildings and men. The thing she had brushed once at the keystone and recoiled from. She looked at the Assay, not the Chandler, the whole apparatus,
The wards and the wilds and the faults and the assets, the load and the toll and the counting spire, all of it at once, laid before her the way a span is laid before an engineer, asked whether it can be brought down. She read it for the one member that held the whole thing up, and she found it. Not a wall, not a pillar, but a rule. The thin, cold law the entire counting house leaned upon, the sentence under everything. I know the sentence because I am made of it. It is this, that what is opened in the book must be closed. That a count begun on a world is binding and must run to its end. That is the law that lights the assets and tears the faults and raises the spire and drives the harvest. Every one of them is only the compulsion to finish an entry wearing a shape. It is the law that made the chandler its enforcer and chained it to the closing. It is the law that made me and set me to cross out 4 million names and would not let me stop. It is the pillar, and Joss Harrow looked at it the way she looks at a bridge she means to bring down, and she found where it bears its own weight, and, deliberately this time, no flinch, no borrowed heartbeat, she spoke. She did not break a thing. She unkeyed a law. She said, in the only grammar the fracture site had ever needed, that the sentence did not hold, that what is opened need not be closed, that a count begun is not binding, that the pillar under the whole counting house bore nothing at all, and the law let go. I felt it in myself first, being nearest to it, being nothing but its instrument. The compulsion that had driven my pen across 900 books and would not release me. The need to finish, to close, to cross out, simply was not there. It did not lift the way a weight lifts. It had never been. I was, mid-sentence, mid-name, unchained. The 4 million entries I had been made to close hung open in my hands forever, and no law in all creation now said they must be finished. And I understood at last what she had climbed toward, and what I had been hoping for without daring to name it, and I wept, if a thing like me can weep, in gratitude to an error. But it cost her. Everything she seats costs her a human thing, and this seated the deepest tear there is. To speak to a law she had to stand, for the instant of speaking, outside all law, outside the count, outside the fall of things, outside time and the plain mortal frame the rest of us are held in. And when the instant passed, she did not come all the way back inside it. Something of her belonging to the ordinary world, her place among things that are bound, as everyone is bound, stayed out past the edge with the sentence she had undone. From that moment she was only ever partly subject to the rules the rest of us live and die under. The throne had not yet touched her, and already it had begun to have her. And the game came apart. Not in fire, the fire was elsewhere, but in unmaking. The faults, which were only torn compulsions, closed like breath let out. The assets, which were only the need to finish an entry given teeth, forgot the need and went still. The Spire's setting bells fell silent between one peal and the next, because a countdown is only a count that must complete, and nothing now said it must. The whole architecture of the Assay, from the drowned faults to the tall floors under her feet, loosened all at once into a thing that no longer had to be. The chandler did not fight her for it. It had never wanted the seat filled for its own sake. It had wanted, across more time than I can hold, to be let down. And here was a release it had not imagined in all its hunting. Better than a replacement, better than an heir. Not someone to take up its chain, but the chain itself undone.
I watched the tiredness go out of it. I watched the courtesy it had worn like a coat over an old wound come away. And under it, there was only a very ancient thing, unbound at last, looking at the woman who had unbound it. It did not thank her in words. I think it had forgotten the ones that would fit. It simply came apart into rest, the way a held breath finally goes, and it was gone. And the office it had carried across the burning of worlds stood empty on the reckoning floor. But the world was still burning. That is the thing the unmaking could not reach. The count no longer had to be closed, yet the closing already lit under my world went on guttering it toward the dark, the way a set fire does not go out because the one who lit it has been pardoned. The spire had stopped rising, but it had risen nearly all the way, and what it had already spent was spending still, and there was only one thing left in all creation with the weight to halt a harvest already in motion. It was standing empty at her side. The ledger offered itself to her. Unheld now, uncompelled, wanting nothing, it simply opened, the way the seat at the bottom of everything opens to the one soul that has proven it can bear the load. Take it up, and hold the weight, and stop the flame, and be spared nothing. She had broken the game so that no one would ever have to sit it, and the only way left to save the world the game had already set alight was to sit it anyway. She stood over the empty office with the dark hanging open at the floor's edge, and her drowning world guttering below. And the throne waited, and everything, the world, the woman, the last of what a load-bearer is not permitted to keep, hung on whether she would sit. The throne did not command her. That was its strange courtesy at the last, after 900 worlds of compulsion, after a law that drove my pen and drove the chandler's chain, the seat that ran all of it stood open and wanted nothing. It did not need her to sit. It offered. And below us, through the open edge of the reckoning floor, the world she had climbed up out of went on burning. The fire already lit, that the unmaking could not reach, guttering her drowned harbor toward the dark one avenue at a time. She stood a long moment reading it, and I know now what she was doing, because it is the only thing she ever did. She was measuring the load. 2 doors. Walk down, keep her own face, and let the flame finish. Or sit, hold the weight of every world the Assay had ever spent, be spared nothing, so that this one world might be. She had broken the game so that no one would ever have to sit it. She sat it anyway. I want it recorded that she did not hesitate. A self is a fair price for a world. She had decided that on the floor below, and I had watched her decide it, and she did not undecide it now. She sat down into the ledger the way she had once sat at a drafting table, squaring herself to a thing that had to hold. The flame stopped. Not slowly. Between one guttering and the next, the world simply held, the way a beam holds when at last something gets under it. The sea did not go back. The dead did not come up. But the count that had been closing stopped closing, because the thing that closes counts had, for the first time in 900 worlds, sat down on the side of not finishing. Then it began to take her, in the order the chandler had promised. It took her place in time first. I felt the current she had ridden her whole mortal life let go of her, the plain forward drift that carries the rest of us, that had carried her down the last train and up the last floor. She stepped off it, and once she was off it, time stopped being a thing that happened to her and became a thing she watched. Down on the far shore, the remnant of the underpin built a life, and from where she now was, it took no time at all. They raised a wall against a sea that would not rise again. They planted. They grew old. I watched it go past like weather, faces thinning and graying and carried under. She could not go down to them. A load-bearer who steps back into the current has let the current take the weight, and the weight was the world. To her, the whole span of their lives was one afternoon, seen through a window she could not open. And Nadi lived through that afternoon. Nadi Crane, who had kept things from breaking her whole life, who had gone back onto a falling bridge for someone slower and been pulled from the black water with part of her left under it forever. Nadi lived out her marked life on that shore. She did not follow into the office. Joss had sent her back at the threshold precisely so that she would live it. And she did. She grew old on the far side of the glass, and she did not turn from the woman on the throne. Not once, not in all the years I watched her not do it. Joss kept her. Of everything the office was burning out of her, she held on to Nadi longest. The last human thing left in her. The final unpaid thing. Whatever had passed between them at the threshold, the small thing handed over or handed back, passed in the margins I cannot read, so I cannot tell you what she held. Only that she held it, and that it was the last of her that was still a person and not a pillar. I was there for the parting. I will not pretend it was a scene. Nadi grew old and Nadi died, the ordinary way, on a shore, in a life, having kept from breaking as long as a person can. And from where Joss stood, it was over in the length of a held breath, and there was nothing she was permitted to do but watch it be over. She did not stop the world to grieve. A load-bearer who stops has dropped the world. But I will testify that for one instant, before the office took the last of it, something in her tried to stop, the part that would halt for one person. And it was not permitted to stay, and so it went quiet, the way her mercy had gone quiet on the floor of the cornerstone, the way each human thing had gone quiet in its turn. And then even Nadi thinned. That is the cruelest line in this account, and I set it down plainly. The memory did not stay sharp. A thing that holds the weight of every world has no room to keep one face at its full size. And so, over what I can only call a very long time, Nadi wore down in her, never crossed out, never forgotten, but thinned the way a name thins on a stone left too long in the weather. After that she was, very nearly, the thing I had feared. The centuries went by like the afternoon had. She held the weight and the weight held. Worlds turned under her that never knew they leaned on a woman who had once designed a bridge across a harbor. She did not spend them. That is the whole difference, and it is not small. The Chandler had spent world after world hunting a relief it never found. Joss, having taken the seat so no one else would ever be hunted for, did not hunt. She simply bore it, numbly, for longer than I have a number for, and I keep every number. I began to believe there was nothing left of the error in the office. Only the load, and the courtesy, and the tiredness. The same three things the Chandler had worn down to. And then, after all that numb time, she reached down. I felt it before I understood it. Far out across the worlds she now bore, a long way from anything she had reason to look at, there was a single, struggling soul, small and losing, the way people lose. A pillar does not notice one grain of the load. She noticed it. She reached down and nudged it, very gently, toward a destiny it would never have found on its own, the way you set your thumb against a thing about to fall the wrong way. I know how to read the shape of a choice, even when I cannot read its margins,
and the shape of this one was unmistakable. She chose that soul because it reminded her of Nadi, because it kept trying to keep something from breaking.
Thinned as the memory was, worn to almost nothing, it was still in there, still steering, and it steered her hand toward one small, far-off person who was going down for someone slower, and it would not let that person go under. That was when I knew she had not become the Chandler after all. The Chandler spent worlds looking for its own relief. Joss spent one small mercy, on nothing, for no gain, because a woman she could barely still remember would have wanted her to. And she did one thing the Chandler in all its 900 worlds never did. She left a gap. In the vast, seamless, load-bearing thing that was the office, she left, on purpose, one flaw. A seam kept deliberately unclosed. A way in. She who could read any structure for the exact point where it breaks had built into the very throne a fracture with her own name on it, so that someone, someday, climbing up out of some far world the way she had climbed out of hers, might find it and press it and stop her, or sit down beside her, or take the weight and let her, at the very last, put it down. The Chandler had hunted for that door and could not make one because it clutched its own face and its own freedom both. Joss made the door easily. She was the one soul the office ever held who had already decided a self was a fair price, and so she could afford to leave open the way to her own unseating and not grasp the seat against it. I was a clerk. I want that understood. I closed 900 worlds and wept for none of them. I was assigned to this world's book, 4 million names deep, and I was assigned, at the end, to do the one thing a ledger is for, to reach the last living entry, the one that would not stop mattering, and cross it out. I never could. Her name is the only entry in all my books that stands open still, uncrossed and unclosable, because the law that said it must be closed is undone, and she is the one who undid it. She sits out there now bearing the weight of every world, thinned nearly to a pillar, holding one worn-down face and one deliberate flaw against the day someone comes. I am unchained. I could go. I have stayed, bound to her book now by nothing at all except that I would rather witness her than be free of her. If you have come this far, it is because you found the seam. It has your name on it, too. She is very tired, and she has been waiting for you a long time.